Hello there, people of the internet. So I've been experimenting with black powder for a while now. I make it myself. You guys have seen me make and use it plenty of times on the channel. But one of the things that I'm fascinated with is getting as much power as possible with the bare minimum amounts of black powder. Now what I mean by that is, well, a lot of people talk about black powder in a survivalist context, and I understand that if we get to the point to where you're having to make your own powder to use in a survival situation, things have gone really, really wrong. And realistically, I don't think we're ever going to get to that point, especially just with how much smokeless powder is out there, but it is possible. But anyway, having a black powder potassium nitrate farm, it takes a long time. It takes about a year or so to get the nitrates from that farm. Now, there's a lot that goes into it. It just takes a long time, and typically your potassium nitrate farms really don't yield all that much result. And so as a result of that, if you go out and get yourself a nitrate farm and you utilize that to grow your nitrates and you wait a long time for it, bottom line, you're not going to have a lot of spare powder. So how much powder do you have to use in order to still get something that is viable for what most people would need a survival rifle to be able to do? And realistically speaking, something like this for a survival rifle is a really, really good component because you can run this thing pretty much indefinitely. So there's a couple of things that I want to talk about here. Number one, let's just talk about the amounts of powder that you have. Now, because of powder density and how I make my powder, all of these are weighed and they're not measured out by volume, and I'm going to touch more on that later on. So by weight, I have noticed with the powder that I make, of course you can make more powerful or less powerful powder depending on the ingredients that you use, how long you mill it, etc., etc. There's a bunch of stuff that goes into that, but for the average person making black powder, especially for me, this is what you can come to expect. If you use about 75 grains of powder with a muzzle loader like this is a 50 caliber muzzle loader, and I'm rocking just round ball. It's around 180 grain round ball. Again, that depends on the alloy it is that you're using, so we're just going to call that about the average. You're looking at about 1,800 feet per second, which is a fair, respectable amount of velocity for black powder muzzle loader with a round ball. But that's also a fair amount of powder. 75 grains, if you keep doing that over and over and over, I get that you're having quite a fair amount of powder, but you're going to burn through a lot of powder really quickly. Most of the time, if people go out and they use their muzzleloader, they're typically using around a 50 grain charge, not unless they're doing something specifically that requires more power. But that 50 grain charge, same powder, same everything, you're looking more like 1,600 feet per second, or at least that's what I'm getting with my particular powder. There's a lot of different things that you can do to change that number. This is not a steady, hard, fast rule. This is more or less representation. But you'll notice that's a 50% increase in powder charge for only 200 feet per second more. I know I get that the 1,800 feet per second is going to have more power, more energy downrange, but 180 grain round ball moving at 1,600 feet per second is still a pretty significant force to be reckoned with. Now, all of that being said, if you decrease the powder again to about a 30 grain charge, I've noticed I still get about 1,400 feet per second from the muzzleloader. Now, all of that being said, as you decrease more and more, you start to see more significant drop-offs. Like this right here is not quite a 50% decrease. We're going to go ahead and call it like a 40%. I don't know if that's the exact number that we're looking at here, but you're looking at a still pretty significant decrease in the amount of powder it is that you're using. But once you get below that 30 grain charge, I've noticed that the velocities drop off quite a bit. Like if you were to use a 20 grain charge, you're looking at more like 1,000 feet per second. You're starting to lose a lot more velocity in comparison to the powders that you're using. So I would say just on average that 30 grain charge in a muzzle loader is probably going to be that Goldilocks area, depending on the powder it is that you're using, the ingredients, etc., etc. It's going to vary a lot. Again, this is not hard, fast rule. This is just representation purposes. But a 30 grain charge to get a fair amount of velocity that is probably going to be quite effective on whatever it is that most people need a survival rifle to be able to do. I could get 30, 60, like 2.5 shots with this 30 grain charge at 1400 feet per second in comparison to just one shot with that 75 grain charge. That's a significant amount of powder that you're saving. And if all you're doing is, say, going after coyotes, possums, raccoons, maybe some small deer, you could probably pull this off with. As a matter of fact, I'm willing to bet you could probably hit a deer with a ground ball moving at 1400 feet per second, and it would probably go down. But my point is, we could have significantly more charges and significantly more rounds that we could send down range with that conservation of powder because of those diminishing returns that you get with black powder. Now, I'm sure that the differences are going to be different in, say, a revolver, because you got that shorter barrel and there's more aspects that you got to look at and whatnot, but the differences are definitely there. Like, for example, with a revolver, if you use a 15 grain charge versus a 25 grain charge, how much of a velocity difference is that? Is that 200 feet per second? How fast is it actually going? 1,000 feet per second versus 800 feet per second? I'm willing to bet that 800 feet per second is still going to be quite effective, and you're going to save a lot of powder in doing so. Now, I know that I had talked about powder densities, and I do powder density very, very, well, I do a lot with powder density. So whenever I make my powder, I make screened powder, and that means non-compressed black powder. And what that means is that it is less dense than the black powder that you normally get out there on the market. And that means that it is less powerful. Now, the reason why I do that is because I typically use cartridge cases with a lot of the black powder stuff that I use. And if you load black powder into a cartridge case, you want to either fill it up or use some kind of filler. I don't like using filler. That adds a lot of complexity. There's a lot that can go wrong with it. Just, I get that you'd have to be pretty stupid to mess it up, but I'm pretty stupid, so I might mess it up. But anyway, my point being, it is easier just to have a less dense powder, in this particular case a screen powder, versus the compressed black powder if you want to have a certain amount of grainage inside of your cartridge. Like, for example, I use this stuff in my 4570. 4570 with actual proper spec commercial compressed black powder, that has a lot of power behind it. The 4570 is certainly no joke. It sends typically I use 300 grain bullets, so we would say that probably moves around 14, maybe 1500 feet per second, depending on barrel length, the powder that you use, etc., etc. You're looking at around there. Well, with screened powder, since it is significantly less dense, even though I'm filling that cartridge case up with 70 grains by volume of black powder, the density is more like, say, a 40 grain charge, and as a result of that, the power I have in that cartridge is not nearly as much. And as a result of that, with that powder being less dense, a pound of powder with 70 grains by volume inside cartridges goes a lot farther than a pound of powder of that more dense material, because you're looking at probably about half the density. So I should be able to, in theory, get about twice the amount of cartridges, maybe a little bit less, but about twice the amount of cartridges with that less dense powder if I'm making a pound of it. Because whenever you make the powder, you weigh it out, and then you screen it, and it's just not going to be as dense. Granted, it's not going to be as powerful, I get that, but you're going to have a lot more shots. And if your shots are powerful enough, and they absolutely are, if they're powerful enough to do the job that you want your rifle to be able to do, then there's a lot of benefits for that. You're not going to burn through as much powder as you normally would if you were to properly compress that black powder, which would give you a lot less volume of black powder, and then you have to fill up your cases with that powder or use some kind of filler. Again, I don't like doing that. So there's a lot that goes into the concept of using black powder and the diminishing returns behind it, and trying to stretch that powder as far as you possibly can with the systems it is that you're running. And, well, that's just something that I'm kind of nerding out on right now. And from what I have been able to find, using screened powder and weighing the charges in a muzzle loader to get the proper velocities that you want, or using the volume inside of cartridge cases so you get not as powerful of cartridges, I think that this is the best way to go to get the most amounts of powder usage from the amount of powder that you can get. Because after you have that farm and you got that 1 year of farming with that potassium nitrate farm, now you got to wait another year for more nitrate to start to form from the bacteria. There's a lot that goes into the science behind that we're not going to get into this particular video. But it takes a long time to make that powder. And if you're going to be making that powder, it's really not going to be all that much powder that you're going to be making. You're going to be limited on your resources is what it is that I'm getting at. And having the most amount, like being able to stretch it out as much as you possibly can, is absolutely the way to go. So a 30 grain charge at 1400 feet per second, I would take that, unless I'm going after like known bigger game where I want that extra energy on target. But for the most part, I'm not doing that. But I would take that in a survival situation over the 75 grain charge, which really only gets you another 400 feet per second. Now, I get that that is a pretty substantial amount of increased energy, but the 30 grains, that's going to produce a cartridge, or that's going to produce a round ball traveling at a velocity that is probably going to handle most of what I need it to be able to handle. So this is just what my current nerding out thing is right now, and I wanted to go ahead and share that with you guys, because I've been just kind of experimenting with what it is that I can get away with. So thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below is a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off. Have yourself a fantastic day. I'll see you in the next episode.
Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. The poor man's Garen. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.